The self-edit's so hard. Like, let's just put it out there. It can be made easier and more streamlined, but it's going to be hard. There's parts that are going to be fun because you'll see a paragraph or a scene or whatever it is that you're like, this is cool. I can't believe I wrote it. That will happen. But I'd say the majority is like, oh, this feels like a mess. And what am I going to do? And so all the feelings are valid. And I think that's really important to note. It's also important to note that it's probably going to take longer than you think. And that's normal too. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you or your book.
Welcome to the Write It Scared podcast. I'm your host, Stacey Fraser, a formerly repressed creative soul turned fiction writer, story editor, and author accelerator certified fiction book coach. At Write It Scared, we tell the truth about why writing a novel is so hard by acknowledging that most writers grapple with two stories. The one they want to put on the page to the best of their ability, and the often subconscious internal story that prevents them from doing it. This show is designed to help you identify and rewrite the internal narrative holding you back while you discover and write the story you want to tell and learn all the tools to help you do that successfully. Join me each week for a new episode where we'll talk about writing to deepen our understanding of the craft and of ourselves as writers. Writing a novel is an inside job that we do not do alone. Welcome to Write It Scared. I'm glad you're here. Let's dive in. Hi, writer. Welcome back to another episode of the Write It Scared podcast. I'm your host, Stacey, and I'm very excited to bring this episode to you today. We're going to talk about how to self-edit your manuscript. Summer is winding down, and when this episode releases, it should be about mid-August. And I know a lot of writers who take the summer off of their writing because they're resting and they're planning to dive back into their edits in the fall. So I got together with Savannah Gilbo, who is a book coach and developmental editor that I greatly admire, to break down the process of self-editing. And I'm so pleased to bring Savannah onto the show. I'm going to give her an introduction here in a moment. But first, I wanted to let you know that in the show notes are several resources from both Savannah and I to help you work through the phases of the self-editing process. Savannah has a revision checklist, and I have a revision workbook and checklist guide as well. So please make sure you check out the resources in the show notes. Savannah is a certified developmental editor and book coach who helps fiction authors write, edit, and publish stories that work. She is also the host of the top-rated Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast, which you should definitely listen to, where she delivers weekly episodes full of simple, actionable, and step-by-step strategies that you can implement into your writing right away. So let's jump into the interview and talk all about the self-edit and revision. Hi, Savannah. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I gave you a bit of a bio, but would you please tell our listeners just a bit more about your journey to becoming a developmental editor and a book coach?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Like Stacey said, I'm a developmental editor and a book coach, which is really just a fancy way of saying I help people write, edit, and publish stories that work and that they're proud of. So the main way I do that is through my podcast, Fiction Writing Made Easy. I have a course called Notes to Novel. And I don't work with as many one-on-one writers as I used to anymore, but that's just because I'm so focused on my course. And that's what I do in a nutshell.
Awesome. Yeah, I've admired you for years. I've been a long time listener, first time caller of the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. So if you're a new listener or new to writing podcasts, please go check it out. It is a top-rated writing podcast, incredibly helpful, applicable to really any stage of the writing game. You could be brand new or you could be wanting to go a little deeper. Absolutely. So
that's the goal too, to make it quick and actionable. And I hear a lot of people saying, I listened to the one thing on genre or scene writing, and then I came back a year later and it, you always take something new, just like as we read our favorite books and take something new. So.
Right. Same with craft books too.
Yep.
When you reread those craft books, you're like, oh, I didn't get that last time.
Yeah, now I get it.
Right. So how did you get here? How did you get to the spot where you're a developmental editor and a book coach?
Yeah, so I worked in the surf industry for a long time. I spent 15 years in the surf industry, and I'm not meant for a corporate job. So I slowly realized that over time, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to work for myself, but I didn't know what that would look like. And it was one of those weeks where I was just like, I hate my job. What am I going to do? That I came across an editor certification program and went down that path thinking that I want to write books and this is going to help me write better books. So it was a selfish endeavor. But then realizing I could make money from doing that, I was like, this is the thing I want to do. So that's long story short, how I got here.
I love it. I have a kind of similar, came from a completely different background and also wanted to write my own books and was trying to just become a better writer. And then it was like, oh, I really like this. And I really like helping people bring their stories into the light.
Yeah.
Well, a big part of this podcast is helping writers find and learn the tools that they need to craft and publish stories that they're proud of. And so today we are going to talk about revision and specifically how a writer can confidently approach the first step in the process, which is the self-edit, which is where you take your messy first draft and you fix it.
Yeah. And the self-edit's so hard. Like, let's just put it out there. It can be made easier and more streamlined, but it's going to be hard. There's parts that are going to be fun because you'll see a paragraph or a scene or whatever it is that you're like, this is cool. I can't believe I wrote it. That will happen. But I'd say the majority is like, oh, this feels like a mess. And what am I going to do? And so all the feelings are valid. And I think that's really important to note. It's also important to note that it's probably going to take longer than you think. And that's normal too. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you or your book. It's a process. It takes multiple passes and can be hard.
Yeah. And I will say that you do get more efficient at it. The more time you're in this, the longer you're in the writing game, the more books that you have under your belt, you do get more efficient. And speaking for myself, I know I have come to enjoy revision. I used to just love to draft because there was freedom and I could play and whatever. But now I really, really enjoy revision because I understand the process and I've seen it makes it so much stronger.
Yeah. And on that note, I've seen many writers convert from I'm scared of this, I hate it, to revisions are the favorite part of my process.
Yeah.
So also if that's happening to listeners, totally normal. It's kind of, in my opinion, where I would want to get to, right? Where you're loving the revision process as much as you like the writing process. So yeah. I love that you're like that too.
And it is a step that you cannot skip.
Yeah.
Unless you are one of those 1% writers out there who edits as they go and creates a cohesive book by the end of it, you cannot skip the self-edit. Even if you are that kind of writer, you still can't skip the self-edit. So we're going to break down like the different phases. So number one, why can't you skip it? What do you have to say to that? Why can't you skip a self-edit?
Well, I mean, in theory, you can do whatever you want, right? So if you don't care about what kind of book you're producing, or if you don't want others to read it and enjoy it, then sure, do whatever you want. But we don't want to skip it because we want the vision that's in your head to match what you produce on paper. And our first drafts they're not going to be that, So I think part of it, for the writers I work with anyway, it's unwinding that expectation that I'm going to produce something that matches what's in my head. Not always, right? So revisions really help you do that. And they help you deliver on the reader's expectation. They help you highlight your theme more and, just make everything better. So,
right.
Really important.
So with that, so the self-edit is the step that you take before you decide to do really anything else with it, before you decide to go off to a developmental editor or go look at the different types of copy editing are available, or maybe query or whatever it is that you're going to do with it. So the self-edit is the first step. And so what do you think is a great mindset for writers to approach the self-edit? We kind of touched on that a little bit. It's going to take longer than you think it's going to take. That's okay. All feelings are warranted.
Yeah.
I would add that you do it in layers. It's not like you start at the beginning and you work your way to the end.
Yeah.
It's done in segments and in layers. And I think it's really important to remember to congratulate yourself, celebrate like every little phase that you make it through, right? We'll break those phases down for listeners here in just a second, but celebrate and take a little rest.
Definitely.
You don't have to grind at this. I mean, you can, and I've done it that way, but it hurts.
Yeah, it hurts. And I think this is why it takes longer than we expect too, because some writers, they sit down with their first draft and they're like, I'm going to do one pass and then I'm going to send it to an editor, or I'm going to get it copy edited. And then they, let's say they go through this process and they're all the way at the copy editor, and the copy editor's like, this story doesn't really read right, and then they have to kind of go back and start over. So it's important to go into it with that mindset that there are multiple passes you'll need to do. It probably will take longer than you think if you're brand new to all of this. And also, if you find yourself at a point where you're like, I know I'm supposed to self-edit before enlisting help, but you can't because of whatever reason, like it's your first time, you're overwhelmed, or it's just really hard, you can enlist help. Like that's okay too. So
Absolutely. And a book coach or a developmental editor at that stage in the game might be life-changing, honestly.
yeah.
It was for me.
Yeah.
So let's break down. I know that you have a really cool system. I have a very, very similar system, but talking about these phases of the self-edit. So where do you have writers start?
Yeah. So, well, I kind of want to back up to phase 0 because I think it's important to take a break.
That is such a good point.
Done. Yeah. So I was going to ask you, how do you feel about that? But I think we're on the same page. Like, you don't want to just normally, unless you're, on a deadline or unless you're just like the type of person this works for, but you don't usually want to dive right into revisions because space and getting that objectivity or that time away from your story is critical to making the phases work as they should.
100%. Okay. Actually, I just had a writer finish their first draft day before yesterday, and we were talking about how long they should wait. And it's different for everybody, but I say, give yourself as much time as you can stand. Mm-hmm. My recommendation was to take the summer off from the novel and try to think about it this way. Your book, this is probably going to sound a little woo, but your book is an entity. It has energy, and it's been working right along with you this whole time. It needs rest too.
Right.
And so if you let it rest and you take a rest, then what that will do is give you perspective so that you can come back with objectivity, because that's really what you need to put your editor's hat on.
Yeah. And that's what, I find too, that when writers don't take breaks, they panic, they get overwhelmed, they reach out to a developmental editor, and then it's like, I kind of know what the editor's telling me to do. I know that intrinsically. And it's like, the reason you couldn't execute it is because you didn't take that break. You didn't get that objective set of eyes, and then your editor did. So, totally agree. It's just take a break. I always recommend at least 4 weeks. But I've had writers who they're like, I can't. So I'm like, okay, give it at least then a week, some time away is key.
Yeah. And if that's not working for you, it's okay. You can stop and you can change your contract and extend that break for yourself.
Yeah. The other thing too is it's not just about the objectivity, even though that's a huge thing. It's also about recharging your batteries and refilling your creative well, because I've had this happen to me. I've seen it happen to the writers I work with. They think they're geared up and ready to go. And then 2 weeks in, they're like, I hate my story. I feel tired of everything. I should have taken that break. So kind of learn from the people that have gone before you. If you're not a fan of taking a break, and just say, I'm going to trust that they know what they're talking about.
I love that. That is fantastic. Okay. So first phase of the self-edit, what do you recommend, and how do you take writers through it?
So to me, this is that big picture. It is the developmental edit. It's looking at your story and saying, do I have the ingredients I need to make what's on the page match my head? So is the plot working the way that I want it to? Are the characters, do they have a nice arc? Do they have motivations and backstories and all these things? Does it start in the right place and end in the right place? Is there, just these big picture elements? Am I using too many point of view characters, not enough point of view characters? This is where I find a lot of people realize, I don't know if I have a good enough antagonist, right? It's a key part of a story, so that you're looking for these really big things. And this is the section that's going to take you the longest, because all these big things work together. So if you find, let's say, your character's backstory isn't totally developed, that's a big deal for many reasons. One, your character's arc of change might not be working, probably because there's not enough backstory. The plot won't challenge that wound or that inner obstacle that is specific to them. So you'll need to change certain things. Once you find out kind of where the holes are and you beef them up, other things are going to need to change. It's like a row of dominoes.
Yeah, it can be very overwhelming. And I think one of the tools that I use with writers to help them get that big picture, or that 30,000 foot view, as I like to call it, not my term, stole it from somebody else, is to do an as is outline.
Yes.
So you bring, you first thing is read, which I think both of us have our writers do, but neither of us said, is we have them read the draft, right?
Yes,
read it as is, and try to take away from that just the experience of the story. Does it make sense? Does it work? And, and then if you're a note taker, take some notes, but don't change anything.
Yes. Because you will find more things that need to be changed. So don't go nuts.
Yeah, don't change anything. Just read it, assess it for the experience of the story, and note, okay, what needs to shift, what needs to change. And I have my writers read it a second time. So the first time, like I make them shove it over to a PDF that they can't touch and they read it and they can take notes, but I specifically want them to take notes on what they like.
Yeah.
What do they like about it? And then what are the things that just like is scratching at their brain? Like, oh my gosh, this is so hideous. Write those things down.
Yeah.
And then I have them reread it again.
Yep.
And from that second reread, we do our as is outline. So that's where we write down what is happening. How does it move the story forward in each scene? And does it make sense?
Yeah. And so we could probably go on a tangent about this for another hour, but I call it a reverse outline. I know that's not a term I made up either. There's terms in the industry, as is, reverse outline, whatever. It's basically a reflection of what your story is in an outline form, and you can pressure test it a lot easier than going into your 80,000 words, right? So you might find, like, I see this happen too sometimes where it's like, on the scene level, things kind of work. So there's like a goal, the character's doing something, there's a choice in the scene, whatever. But then when you zoom out, you're like, okay, the beginning of my story reads like a romance and the end reads like a crime story. Like, how did this happen? So to recap, step 0, take a break. Step 1, read through it, create your scene list or your reverse outline, your as-is outline. And then you're looking for these big picture issues that this is the same stuff a developmental editor would look, but you're the first line of defense. So you're like, okay, you're going to find much more than you think too. Like sometimes writers are like, how will I know? And I'm like, you'll know. You'll know.
Yeah. Yeah, you will. You will. Because it comes down to, is it logical? And does it have forward momentum? And is the story growing in tension and suspense? And that is true regardless of the genre that you're writing in. Okay, cool. So that's the big picture. And Savannah, I think you have a really good resource too for writers, like a checklist, right?
So yes, I have a editing checklist that you can download if you go to savannahgilbo.com/editing-checklist. And I'm sure Stacy will throw that in the show notes.
100%. We'll definitely throw that in the show note.
Yeah. Awesome. So that'll walk you through these phases we're talking about, but also this, because people ask me like, when do I need beta readers? When do I need developmental editors? And like Stacy and I said earlier, anytime that you feel stuck or you're like, let's say you go through this, you've read your draft, you've compiled your as-is outline, you've identified holes and you're like, okay, I don't know what to do with this. That's a great time to get some outside feedback or to get a coach. I know some writers even have trouble. They're like, I read it and I know certain things don't work. I don't know what those certain things are. I just know I don't feel good reading this part. So that can be where you use beta readers. And, some people get nervous about that too, because they're like, but my story is totally not perfect. That's kind of what we're all here for in the, beta reader editing profession. So don't be afraid to get help at this stage if you need it.
Yeah. Excellent advice. Okay, so we kind of recapped like the first phase is like this big picture, overarching story assessment involving our characters, their arcs, the logic of the plot, the consistency and the character's agency. Are they moving forward? Are they driving things forward? So then once you're done, and like Savannah said, you may have to do several passes through this structural edit. Yeah. It's definitely not a one and done thing. So you might be moving scenes around here. You may be creating a whole new subplot. You might be adding in or subtracting or merging characters at this point. So it feels like a lot and it can feel pretty messy. That's normal.
It's very normal. And I think it's a good thing because that means you've gained that clarity on what you want your story to be. And now you're saying, I've kind of done this vomit draft and there's stuff on the page and at least now I know what I want. It's just now the hard work of making it that. So,
right. This is why they say that the book is made in revision. It's not made in drafting.
Exactly. And it's also why I recommend people, I don't want to say rush through the first draft, but it's like, don't worry about it being perfect. Don't put it off until you feel like you're more quote unquote ready, because it matters, but it really doesn't matter because this phase of the revision process is where you're really making your story a story. So I like to say just get it done as soon as you can and you'll have more to work with.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we talk about the second level?
So you've done the big picture stuff. You have made changes probably in your draft or at least on like a new version of an outline. So sometimes writers aren't ready to quite go in their draft and make changes yet. So they'll create like they have their as is outline and then a brand new outline where they're tracking the new developments. So then what you'll want to do is dive a layer deeper. So you want to go into each of your scenes and you're pretty much asking a lot of the big picture questions still. So you're like, does this scene serve the plot? Can I do more in this scene than, just establish a piece of my world building? Is there enough conflict and tension in each of these scenes? Is there an arc of change? Is that change appropriate, right? Because I'll see writers where they're like, well, in this scene, there is an arc of change. And I'm like, yeah, but your character went from being hungry to not hungry or vice versa. Like unless you're writing something about food, that's not that impactful, right?
Or my character went from damsel in distress to warrior.
Right. And you're kind of like,
there wasn't any shift. There wasn't we didn't have any steps to get
right. This is, if you haven't identified that already at the big picture level, you'll identify it in this scene pass where it's like, and this is true I see this in romance arcs where it's this kind of what you said, where it's like all of a sudden they've gone from enemies to friends in like one scene and you're like, that might be too quick, right? So if you haven't identified that stuff in the big picture, you will get it here. But assuming that you get most of it in the big picture phase, you're going a layer deeper. So you're looking at the scenes. Are they balanced? Are they like an appropriate word count? Is everything in there that needs to be in there? Is there info dumping, head hopping? Like you're looking for all these things at the scene level. And some of these discoveries might make you go back to phase 1 and go back to revising more story level stuff. That's also normal. But once you go through this phase, you should, however many times you need to go through it, you should feel confident by the end of this phase that my big picture story works and each of my scenes are doing the heavy lifting they should be doing and they're moving the story forward and they work.
Yes. And I have writers do the similar thing. Oftentimes they're creating a new outline. They're taking what they have, they're merging it with what they need to create a very solid scene list.
Yeah.
And then they go into their draft and they start actually moving things around. And and there might be big pieces where there's holes where new scenes have to be drafted.
Yeah.
Or where scenes have to be cut and put over in a cuts file. Cuts files are awesome, by the way, if nobody's ever heard of that. It's just a file where you put all the stuff that you don't think you need in your novel, but it's not really gone. It's over there in the cuts file, so you didn't delete anything. It's safe. It's safe over there. Okay, so pretty much you're going to be set with your story and happy with the way the plot events roll out and the way that puts pressure on your character and creates the overarching change of the story that you're looking for. And you're diving into each scene to make sure that it is
working and moving forward.
Yeah. Right.
And I like to say you're confident like as you can be. You've done the work that you know how to do. So if you haven't already paused and gotten some outside feedback, this is a spot where I would recommend pausing. No matter how you want to publish, we all need that outside feedback. So you can use a beta reading service, critique partners, whatever you have, or a developmental editor or coach. But basically at this point, you want to say, I've done the most I can on the story and I don't know what I don't know. So I need to find that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I heard this rule. I don't know if it's a hard, fast rule, but I heard this idea a long time ago that works for me. Because when you're going through and you're working either in the structural edit part or you're in the scene edit part, you're going to notice a little things, right? That needs to be tweaked. If it takes you 3 seconds or less, you can change it.
Yeah. I like that rule too.
Yeah. If it takes longer than that, leave it. Leave it alone because you don't need to be monkeying with tiny things when that entire scene might go away. Right?
Yeah. And so I don't know if listeners have noticed, but what we haven't said to pay attention to is spelling and grammar and word choice and pulling out your thesaurus. So we are not even concerned with that yet. Even if you're reading it and you're in a scene and you're like, God, this sounds so basic. It sounds like, so cheesy. We don't care at this stage because as long as the movement of the scene or the character or whatever it is that you're working on, as long as that matters, you can let it go for the next pass. So some of that you will catch here in this like scene level pass, but really all the stuff I feel like we love to sit in comes in the next 2 phases, which is where you're looking at your pages. So once you've done the scene, you zoom closer into each page, and then we're going to zoom in again to like line by line.
Mhm.
So yeah, just to point that out, because I know I'm a perfectionist, recovering perfectionist, and there's a lot that I will happily sit in for a long time that doesn't serve me.
Same.
Yeah.
100% same.
Yeah.
Okay. So after you've assessed your scene level and you've gone through all of your scenes, and again, this you might be going back and forth, and you may even have to go back up into the structural level to make some changes. Then once you've got your scenes and you feel like they're turning, right? Meaning that they're engaging, that they're moving the story forward, the passage of time is logical, as is the characters' actions and emotion. Then it's time to drop into the next phase, which for you, how do you break that up? I think you and I
So
do it a
this
little
is
different
like,
here.
this is the phase that I feel like this is what people think editing is. So it's, we're looking for, is everything on each of your pages necessary? Do you have repetitive words and sentences? Are you using way too many adverbs? Like whatever your poison is, because we all have a different poison at this stage. Are you telling too much? Like, are you over describing the world or whatever? Do you have pages of backstory or exposition that you just don't need and you could weave in differently? Do you have action that's, or even sex scenes that are over choreographed, right? Where it's just like, okay, we get it. You know, you can look at things that, like a passage of dialogue. Is it only doing one thing? Could it be doing more? Does it need to be so long? Do you have purple prose? Do you have too many dialogue tags? Or there's like, the list is endless, right? So you're just kind of looking at, okay, assuming the scene works now in this container, is everything really doing double duty and pulling its weight? And if not, what can you do? You can also look at, this is where like you can plant little setups. Like if you need to mention a key that comes into play later in chapter 7, you know, you can slot those in places to check for things like that.
It's definitely a place to think about, you know, how to plant foreshadowing a little more strategically. Also, this phase, if you want to call it the page phase, where you're assessing what's on the page, is really good to read it out loud to yourself or have some sort of tech read it back to you.
Yep, I think so too. There's one called Natural Readers that I like a lot. They have AI voices, but they also have ones that sound like a human. But yeah, if you've never done this before, you'll be surprised how much you catch just reading it out loud.
Yeah. I actually just did it the other day with, I was using Word, and I had just updated my Word, and they came out with a whole bunch of different voices. It was like some very sexy Australian.
Yeah, you're like, I will take this. I love it.
Yeah. So reading it out loud, you're just going to catch a lot. Also, another tip that I've learned is to change the font of your novel so that it's just different than what you've read it before, because you get kind of snowblind.
Totally. You can even go from Word to Scrivener or Scrivener to Google Doc, whatever, to further help that. But yeah, so in this phase, ideally, we're not going back and making too many big picture changes, because this is where it gets really overwhelming. If you're like, I've gone through the 2 big passes already, and now I've decided I need to add another subplot, that to me means you've gone through the other 2 phases too fast. And that's, how are you going to manage all these different things you're trying to do at once? So that's why it's important to break things up. And like we've been saying, spend enough time in the structural and the scene edits, so the big picture edits and the scene edits, until you are confident that it works in general.
Well said. So, and then kind of the last phase of your self-edit is going through for the grammar, right? The grammar and the spelling. It's like the fine-tooth comb.
Yes.
And whether you really hit it hard or not, to me, it kind of depends on what your plans are. Like, what do you want to do with this?
Exactly. And I want to talk about that, but let me back up to where we just were in the page level edit. So at that stage, I like to think about, if you need help, who do you go to? That could be a developmental editor. It could also be a line editor, depending on what that line editor offers, because they can help you find that repetition and, are you using your sentences as wisely as you can? And then into this sentence level edit, where you're really looking at each sentence and you're looking for spelling and grammar, this could be a line editor or a copy editor, depending on the services they offer.
Yeah, and some do both, and you really want to kind of suss that out, tease it out, and see. To me, line editing is kind of about enhancement. It's not so much about correction, and it's subjective, depending on so you want to make sure that if you're working with a line editor, they understand the vision in your characters, because I always. Yeah, I've worked with some, and they've tried to change like the voice and the style, and that doesn't work for me.
Yeah. And that's, I
so
think
it's subjective.
It's subjective, and that's why it's important to sometimes even get sample pages or have a discovery call, whatever that is. But, there's a lot of developmental editors that lean a little towards line editing. There's line editors that lean towards copy editing. So yeah, just research who you're choosing. But in general, these last two phases are usually line editors world, and then at the spelling and grammar copy editors world.
Okay. So that was basically the 4 stages of a self-edit. And I like to just think of it like whatever stage you're in, just make an assessment of what is there. And then from your assessment, kind of devise a plan and of how you want to go about making changes. And then you implement it, and then you assess again. Does it work? Does it not? And sometimes you're going to have to pull out, and you're going to have to get outside feedback. As a matter of fact, it's critical at some point that you have outside feedback at some point. So that might roll us into when you want to go to beta readers, or, consider a developmental edit.
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to keep backing us up because this is what I do. But I think you said the word plan, and my head went to make a realistic plan, because it's one thing to say, oh, okay, sounds good. You guys talked about it so fast and I can see this and I'm going to do it in 3 weeks. And it's like, no, you're not, because you have a full-time job, you have kids, you have whatever. So it's, we keep saying over and over, probably like a broken record, you're going to spend most of your time in the first 2 phases, probably even most of that time in the first phase, looking at those big structural edits. And again, it's like not one pass, right? It's multiple passes. So I just like to say, be realistic. Same with when you're writing, right? You can't assume you're going to write 5,000 words per day if your track record says you write 300, because that's how we set ourselves up for disappointment. So
100%. And that actually pulls us exactly into what I wanted to ask you next, is common pitfalls and traps that writers can avoid. And setting yourself up with realistic expectations, I think is, that's the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
Be realistic. Give yourself a lot of grace, especially if this is your first time editing a novel. And I think you said, ask for help when you don't know what you don't know.
That's what we're here for. So,
right.
Yeah.
And any other traps or pitfalls that you...
Yeah. So trap, like you said, not being realistic, not asking for help when you need it. Those are huge ones. Definitely another huge one is mixing the levels too much. So doing a page edit at the same time you're trying to edit your story. When you hear us explain this, you're probably like, yeah, no wonder that doesn't work. There's so many different things to think about, right? So just don't expect that of yourself. Again, this goes back to having realistic expectations. Plus, there is a method to the madness. That's why there are multiple types of editors, because we need to look at this in passes. And as you go through it, you're whittling down and tightening up your story. And it's just going to make your ultimate job of polishing those pages even easier, which I know we all want to get to because we're closer to finishing our books and things like that. So those are big ones. And then I would say, this is not a pitfall, but make sure you understand, I guess, what your plans are for publishing. And this is, I think, what you were going to get at before is if you're trying to get a traditional publisher, you probably, unless you need help with line editing and copy editing, you probably don't need to take your story through those 2 phases. Again, unless you need help with that, because an agent and an editor at a publishing house, they're really looking to see, does this story work? And they're going to take you through another developmental edit on if you get a deal with them. They're going to take you through a line edit and a copy edit. So it's I want to say 2 things. You want your story to be as best and as presentable as it can be. You don't want to probably be paying tons of money to a copy editor or a line editor when there's going to be those big picture changes if the publishing house takes you through a developmental edit. Anything to add there?
That's very well said. It's hard to know. When I first started writing, I didn't know what I didn't know. And I didn't know if it was good enough, to be honest. I didn't know if it was good enough to try to query. And I thought about spending money on a copy edit because grammar is not a strong suit of mine. It's not in my wheelhouse. I write like I talk, and that's not real pretty either. So I thought about doing that. But instead, what I wound up doing is going out to some beta readers and getting some feedback that way. And, talking to people that I trusted, working with a book coach and those things. I did spend money, but I invested elsewhere instead of.
Yes.
And then I went on and I queried.
And you went about it the way that's like top down. So you're learning how to make your story work and be enticing to those agents and editors versus paying someone to help you correct your grammar, which isn't going to matter if your story's broken. So
yes,
just something
so
for
well
people
said.
to consider. And if you're not sure, that's okay. You know, go through these steps on your own because we are talking about self-editing. So go through all these steps on your own. And at some point, you'll need to make that decision. And then you can figure out where your next steps are. The other last thing I'll say on Pitfalls is people ask me all the time, can I do these stages or phases out of order? Again, you can do whatever you want in theory, but I would say don't do it because it's just going to hurt yourself in the long run. So think about like a funnel, right? We want to funnel our stories go from the big picture down to the small picture. And by the time you get to that polishing phase, you want to have the tightest draft, the best story to polish rather than spending, months polishing something that you're just going to throw out half the scenes, So my recommendation, do not go out of order. Don't try to do too many things at once and have realistic expectations.
And give yourself lots of grace and reach out for help if and when you need it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Savannah. You're just a wealth of knowledge and it's just amazing to have you on the show. So what is your wish for writers working out there through their edits? What wish, or I guess wish, would you like to impart to them?
Yeah, so I think we've said kind of the most key things, like give yourself grace, know it's going to take time. If you set yourself up with realistic expectations, you're going to have, it sounds silly, right? Because it's mindset, but you're going to have a much easier time if you expect the process to go a certain way. And the things we're telling you, we have experience working with writers who do it this way or they do it the backwards way and then they regret it. Whenever I want to learn something or do something new, I look at the people who have gone before me and I say, how can I learn from their mistakes and make the most efficient use of my time? We're trying to give you that roadmap to help you do that. So get the checklist that'll help you go through the different phases of editing, give yourself grace. And if I can back up and give another piece of advice, because again, that's my thing, don't aim for perfection on your first draft. Because like we said in the beginning, this is really where you hone your story. And I hope that encourages you to get through your first draft quicker and not sit on those first 3 chapters, rewriting them over and over and over, because they're never going to be perfect. So just get it down and make the magic in revisions.
I love that. And also just stay open, stay willing to change and ask questions as you go along. I tend to hold a rigid mindset and my characters they get cemented in stone. And I was working with my book coach last month and she gave me a suggestion about how to change some things. And I was like, no, are you kidding? I spent 5 months developing these people. And I wasn't willing right then, but I entertained the idea over a series of weeks and, okay, I could see how that maybe works. So just try to be open, ask questions. When you get suggestions, table them and think about them.
Yeah, well, that's a great point too, because, usually, and it's hard to give blanket advice because some people, your book coach, for example, knows your intentions. So they're giving you this advice, knowing what you're trying to do. So there's kind of 2 buckets advice can fall into. One is you don't know what I'm trying to do and you're giving me these weird ideas. I'm going to table that and just thank you, but whatever. You get to decide, right? Then there's the other part where it's like Stacey's saying she gets it from her book coach who knows what she's trying to do. Yes, you're going to react. I mean, I think 95% of us are going to react don't tell me that. Be open, sit with it, and ask. My favorite thing is ask for the why. What is the why? Why is she saying that? Why does this character in a movie work that I like, but mine of a similar version doesn't work? Always ask why, and you'll usually get to something, even if it's not the exact answer you want.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful place to end it. So thank you so much, Savannah. Where can listeners find you and connect with you and learn more about all the amazing services that you have?
Sure. So I'm just at savannah.gilbo on Instagram, or my website is savannahgilbo.com. I also have the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast, which we talked about earlier. And I'd be happy to hear from everybody.
Right on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you next time. Thank you for listening to the Write It Scared podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please make sure to hit the follow button so you never miss an episode. And please leave a review. Reviews help other writers like you find the voices and messages they need to hear to continue to write their stories. Let's lift each other up. Remember, you can be scared and still be unstoppable. I'll see you next week.